So my air conditioner is running because it's, 90 degrees out today. And so if you're hearing a humming in the background, I apologize for that. I am recording from home. It's summer of 2021. And so I apologize for any annoying noises in the background that makes it punishing to watch my videos. So efficiency trumps accuracy. So I'm going to show you some pieces of evidence that hopefully will illustrate for you that when we're making even just regular cognitive cognitions, non-social cognitions, we tend to be more interested in being quick than right. But definitely, I've got a couple here that I think could be construed as social cognitions also, that you can really see are a little bit more, all those sort of affect-laden issues, and you'll see that it is really difficult for us to worry about accuracy when what we're trying to do is answer the question quickly and not invest too much cognitive effort. So statistical versus anecdotal evidence. Okay, so hopefully you know what statistical evidence is, right? It's like it's data that is directly observable by other people, could be confirmed by other people. It's got at the minimum some descriptive statistics that have been performed on it, like averages or percentages or something like that. At the maximum, it's got some inferential statistics that have been performed on it, like, a t-test to see whether this group is different from that group, something like that. Whereas anecdotal evidence is something that's not backed up necessarily with objective data that other people could observe. It's anecdotal in the sense that it happened to my friend, or, this has happened to me 3 times, so this must be the pattern, or something like that. So, which do you prefer when deciding, let's say there are 2 sections of the same class being offered by 2 different teachers? Do you go look up instructor evaluations, or do you ask classmates who have had that teacher before? A lot of times we ask our classmates because we think, well, they took this class with me. We seem to have, some rapport. Maybe we talk to each other a little bit during class. And so somehow I feel like I trust them more than the objective evidence of like hundreds of students who have had the class from this instructor. I'm going to trust this one person who said something different, right? A lot of times we do that. We trust our classmates over the objective data. Now, just, as an instructor, I would like to point out that one thing about instructor evaluations when they're completely optional is that you oftentimes get the polar ends. You get the people who just love the teacher, and you get the people who just hate the teacher, and nobody in the middle bothers to complete them. And so rate my professor, things like that, you can get a really skewed image. And then, of course, what students want out of the class is oftentimes different from what the teacher wants to put in the class. So, like, rate my professor has how easy it was, how much readings required, things like that, which affects the overall rating of the instructor. Whereas the instructor is like, well, I'm proud that I make them read a lot of things. The students are like, but I don't want to read a lot of things. So just be, both kind of evidence in this particular example that I've given you could be faulty. But on average, more data is more trustworthy than less data. So on average, instructor evaluation should be better than a single classmate or a couple classmates. When you're going to buy a new product, maybe it's kind of pricey, or that there's a lot of variability in quality between brands, but you're not exactly sure which one is the most durable or reliable. Do you go to Consumer Reports and look it up, or do you ask a friend or watch an individual on YouTube who, might have gotten a free one of the objects, and so they maybe aren't being completely honest, or maybe the friend got the one that works, like some of them have to work, but what you're looking for is on average which one works better, right? Ideally, statistically, you should go with the Consumer Reports analysis because they're objective. They buy the product, they don't get it given to them. They haven't got a dog in the fight, basically, is the idea. Whereas your friend or somebody on the internet, you don't know whether there are other factors that are contributing to their analysis. All right, how about another topic, which is people's tendency to believe in the paranormal? So how about in class? I usually like to do this. I go around, and if there's at least 40 people in the class, it always works. I've never had it not work with at least 40 people in the class. Go around and ask everybody, what's your birth date? And not the year, just the birth date, day and month. And the probability is that there will be 2 people in any group of 35 who will share the same, day and month birthday. It always shocks me that it works. I'm always waiting for it not to work, but as long as there's at least 40 people in the room, I've never had it fail. When we believe in the paranormal, though, we ignore statistics, and a lot of times we not only ignore it, but maybe we misapply statistics. So when we say, well, there are 365 possible days that a person could be born, you would need at least 365 people in the room to have 2 match, right? I mean, that should be the odds. And so it's not just that we ignore the statistics. Sometimes we actually misapply them and don't realize that, there are some days of the month, some days of the year that have more babies born on them. A bunch of factors go into this. 2 and 35 should share the same birthday, that we all ignore, because you know what? Efficiency trumps accuracy. So we can't wrap our minds around it, and especially all of us who are psychology majors, we have a lot of difficulty wrapping our minds around the statistic that would lead to 2 and 35 people matching on birthday. So that we end up actually kind of just throwing up our hands and saying, that's impossible. Like that can't be right. It would be 1 in 365. That's all I'm going to say, and that's all I'm going to say, right? And it's because it's hard, or we ignore it, or we don't understand it. So there's an 85% chance that 2 people out of 35 will share the same birthday. How about this? I just watched another show over the break where they were talking about all these boats and planes that disappear in the Bermuda Triangle. It's got this mystique about it where, starting, I think the oldest one, is the old World War II story where the pilot takes off from somewhere in Florida, starts flying east, and then, somehow disappears, gets lost from his group or whatever. And they're like, ooh, the magic Bermuda Triangle. And apparently boats go down and stuff like that. That's the story that they tell. And it's very fun and mystical, and it's really interesting to talk about. And why would it be like this? Is there a magnetic pull? Is there a vortex? Is there something going on? But guess what? None of that matters, because it turns out statistically, fewer planes and boats and things like that have actually gone down in the Bermuda Triangle than other places of similar size. Like I can tell you, for those of us who are in Washington and Oregon, there are many more boats that go down off of the coast of Washington, Oregon, in that area where the Columbia River lets out. And that is because of tides and things like that, because the river brings all this, churning water, and it can suck under boats and stuff like that. Way more dangerous in other comparably sized areas of the world, but for some reason this mystique built up around the Bermuda Triangle, and so we all think that's where an inordinate number of planes and boats go down. We just ignore the statistics on it, and we just find it interesting. How about thinking about someone on the day before they die? If you've ever had this experience where you either were just thinking about them or you had a dream about them, and then the next day you find out that they died, it does sound a little paranormal. It does sound like something caused you to think about them on the very day before they died. But if you just go purely on the number of people who die in the United States per year, the likelihood, and given the population of the U.S. and so on, the likelihood is that 3,250 times a day, just in the U.S., you would have a person who thinks about somebody who ends up dying the next day. Like, just statistically, that's the probability. It's not that mystical. It seems mystical because, coincidences can be quite dramatic, right? And they can really catch our attention. But rather than thinking, oh, what's the likelihood that I would have thought of that person before the day before their death? Oh, it's actually not that uncommon. We just go, wow. We'd rather be quick than accurate, right? So we just go with what is kind of interesting. It's we are very motivated to believe in paranormal kinds of things. We want to think that there are like psychic connections and magical places around the world and things like that. And that we're kind of unique with our birthday, right? It would take 365 people before somebody else in this room would have my birthday. Right? Like, we want to think those things because we want to think those things. And so it's efficiency, and it's also sort of our own desires can kind of run in the face of trying to be as accurate as we can. All right, so we've been talking about cognition and social cognition. Here's a picture from just a non-social cognitive question where we've got a schematic hierarchy for the concept of head. And, they did a really good job of it, that, there are lots of different uses of the word head. So we don't know how people actually organize information in their brain, obviously. But what the most powerful explanations seem to surround this idea of sort of this schematic style organization where little details about the concept are stored at different, we call them nodes, different nodes, which are the connections between two neurons. So where the dendrite of one neuron bumps up against the axon of another dendrite, another neuron. Actually, the terminal fibers, if you want to get fussy for you guys who took biological psych, where those bump up and the neurotransmitters get communicated, that's what we call a node. And we think that each of those nodes holds a little detail about whatever concept we're thinking about. And when the group of neurons that all share little individual nodes about a particular topic get activated, that's what causes us to put it together and think of that concept in a clear way. Now you can imagine that certain inputs would activate parts of this schematic of the head, right? Like maybe you're petting your dog's head. That's going to activate the lower left-hand corner of this schematic. If you're thinking about, home improvements, maybe you're up in the middle there at the top where you're thinking about the nail or the screw head that you're going to either hit with the hammer or use the drill on, right? Different things are going to activate different parts of this schema. And then what we think happens is probably as you start to think about parts of the concept, it spreads, the activation spreads to other parts. And so the fact that you were thinking about a nail head might then make you think that you need to scratch your head because you were thinking about, this schema. Now, the spread of activation isn't complete. It doesn't always go to all parts, but it might spread to unrelated neighboring schemas. So you might be thinking about patting your dog's head, and then that took you over into the concept of dog, and then that got you thinking about the fact that dogs bark, and then bark makes you think about the fact that trees also have bark. Have you guys ever had this kind of weird chain of events in your head, and you're like, how did I go from petting my dog's head to thinking about forest fires? How'd that even happen, right? But you could explain it through the spreading activation, that, schemas are connected to each other through shared concepts, and you can end up in some really weird places when you think about it. So the advantages of using schematic processing, the benefits of having, details stored at each node for one thing, and then having all of those details sort of connected to each other, would be that, you're going to speed up processing, right? If you can dive right into a schema and then automatically start activating things that are related to it, it's going to cause you to go faster than if you have to one by one pull up every single detail about the concept that you're thinking of, and then related concepts and all that stuff. If you store information in a schema, it makes it more organized, right? It's connected to other things that are sort of like it. And so you'll be more likely to be able to find it later when you want to find that piece of information. That's why it's really important when you're studying to think of your own examples that will help to bring the concepts that you're learning to life. Think about something that's happened to you that exemplifies the concept or refutes the concept. That works too, right? If you can personalize it, I told you before earlier in another chapter that your self schema is your most powerful schema. And so if you can relate information to your self schema, that really makes it powerful. If you can relate it to things you already know and that are well organized and well stored in your memory, that also makes it much more retrievable. So schemas help with increased memory. Schemas also are really helpful because they provide our expectations. So I've walked into a situation, and I've been in situations like this before, and so I activate my schema. In this case, it's called a script, but I activate my schema for this situation. So let's say I've walked into a restaurant, and it's a sit-down restaurant. So that activates my schema for what should happen while I'm at a sit-down restaurant, versus if I walk into a restaurant where you order from the counter. That activates that kind of schema. So now I know what should happen because I've walked into this restaurant, I look around, I see that it's not a sit-down restaurant. It's an order at the counter restaurant. Now I know what to do, right? Now, for normal cognition, all that's great, right? In social cognition, it provides expectations. So you say, oh, I've met a person like this before. And that can be the basis of stereotyping. Now I'm treating you like somebody who I've met before, who is kind of somehow like you in some fashion. And you're like, why are you treating me in a way that doesn't seem appropriate for myself? And I'm like, boy, you sure remind me of somebody else. I'm just going to act like you are that person. Right? That's the beginning of stereotyping. So it can really boost efficiency to have your expectations in place. But it can also cause these, disconnects and these problems and, stereotyping and things like that. Schemas are really advantageous for helping us to interpret ambiguous information, right? Sometimes you walk into a restaurant and you kind of can't tell. Am I supposed to order at the counter or am I supposed to sit down? It could go either way. They've got like a cash register in front of what looks like the counter. So is this a sit-down restaurant? Right? These ambiguous situations. What do I do? And so what schemas can do is they can do a quick comparison of all the things that are present that are sort of on the fly getting categorized as either a sit-down restaurant or order at the counter restaurant, right? Maybe looking for signs, other kinds of things. So that you can really quickly figure out what to do with this ambiguous information, how to act in this ambiguous situation. So it can really give you like sort of a leg up, right? You're starting more in the middle of the problem rather than at the very beginning. Now, some of the disadvantages, I see that I've covered up part of what I wrote, but that's okay. It can cause us to jump to incorrect conclusions, right? Isn't that always the risk with using our expectations and our previous experiences and stuff, is that we can jump to the wrong conclusions. We can produce inflexible responses where we're expecting certain things, and so we act like those things actually happened, even though they didn't really happen. So in an interpersonal situation, if I'm reminded of somebody I already know when I first meet you, and I start treating you like the person who I already know, who you remind me of, that's me jumping to conclusions. And then even as you're trying to correct my incorrectness, I'm like still calling you the wrong name, or whatever my outward behavior is that's letting you know that I've jumped to the wrong conclusion. I keep doing it. I'm making this inflexible response because it's my expectation, right? It's so ingrained in my schema that it's really difficult to do anything else. This is one of the things that's making it very difficult to have conversations about the use of male or female or gender neutral pronouns, is that all of us, our entire lives, have been raised with a set of English pronouns that mean certain things, right? And inflexibility is not necessarily a sign of stubbornness. Inflexibility can be a sign of a well-used, well-formed schema. And it's really difficult to ask a person to start speaking in a way that, we speak on the fly, right? We don't have scripts in our heads that we're just reading. We have to make up the chain of words on the fly. And they have to be coherent. We have to apply grammar to them. We have to select the correct vocabulary words. And so, we have to make up these things as we go along. And so we oftentimes rely on our previous experience. And we use the words and all the terms that we are familiar with from previous experience. And that's why, a lot of times to younger people who don't have as entrenched of schemas, they can be a lot more flexible because this can just be part of their schema, right? Like this is how it has been as I've been setting up my schema. For an older person, they have to honestly change their schema. And changing your schema is really, really hard. And I'm not saying that on any particular topic. I'm saying that in every single way. From the time you're a baby, once you think you know the name for something, it's really difficult to change your schema and actually apply a different name. If you have taken developmental psych, you might have learned about Piaget's terms for how we maintain our schema. Our natural instinct is to assimilate new information into our schema so that we don't have to change our schema, but we can try and find a way to make the new information fit into what we already know. And so, for example, my granddaughter, when she first was learning to talk, she called her dog Doe, which was her word for dog, I think. And I don't know how it came to pass that it might have been because she was living in a house, from the time she was about 2 months until she was about 11 months, she was actually living in the house with us, with her mom and her dad. We all had just moved to Cheney, and so we were like trying to find them a place. And so she was living with us, and there were 3 dogs in the house. So I think she heard the name dog a lot applied to these 3 animals that were in the house. Once mom and dad and her moved out, little brother comes along. They're just in their own house with their 1 dog, and that dog's name is Bailey. So he thinks dogs, he's currently 13 months old, coming up on 14 months old, and he calls all dogs Bayi, right? His attempt to pronounce Bailey, which I think is pretty close to Bailey, right? He just doesn't get the L, but he's like Bayi. Bayi is his name for dog. She had a hard time, my granddaughter had a hard time stopping calling each dog Doe and instead calling this one Copper, that one Dash, that one Bailey. That was her hard transition. His hard transition is going to go from Bayi to this one's Bayi, that one's Copper, that one's Dash, and guess what? The group of them is called dog, right? Like that's going to be a big thing for him. And what do? You work with him. That's right. That's Bayi, but this Bayi is called Copper, right? Like you work with him. You don't get mad at him and say he's stubborn and he won't think of another word and he's doing it to be mean, right? If you think about people and especially speech, things that they're doing on the fly, and you think about the fact that we use our pre-existing knowledge bases as, the source of our information, it will cause you to be a lot more tolerant of people's word choices, because you'll realize that it's really, 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 really difficult, especially something fundamental like the use of pronouns, to get people to change on the fly and use a different pronoun from what they've been using for the past 30 or 40 or 50 years. They're not necessarily being stubborn. They're being inflexible because schemas make them inflexible. And it takes so much feedback to change your schema. Piaget says it takes 20 consistent, incorrect pieces of feedback where you're being told, no, that's wrong, 20 times in a row, meaning you're never right in the meantime. You are consistently being told, no, that dog is called Copper. No, that dog is called Copper. That dog is called Copper. Until you finally realize, okay, his name is Copper, right? And you actually change your schema and start calling that dog by its actual name. So if you think about it like that, and you think about an average person maybe not having 20 consistent pieces of information that they're using the wrong word, it's asking a lot for people to be perfect on that stuff and to then impugn them with labels because their inflexible schema is causing them to behave in a certain way. And then, of course, let's just be honest, when a person is just displaying what their schema tells them to do and somebody else calls them names or tells them that they're an awful person, it does cause them to dig in and say, well, you're asking me to do something that doesn't make sense. And so having a little bit of grace for just how people's brains work allows us to be a lot more tolerant of each other as people are learning and making, changes. All right, sorry, I went off on a tiny bit of a tangent, but it's completely related to this issue of schema. So how do we select a schema as we move through the world? How do we decide what set of previous experiences we're going to rely on in this context? Well, one way that we do it is through the use of heuristics. The representativeness heuristic is an example that I wanted to illustrate for you. So I just realized that I didn't have that queued up. So I'm going to stop here. In the next video, we will pick up with heuristics, and I'll have you do something before we talk about it. See you in the next video.